Good morning. Welcome to English Mirror. Today we analyze the text titled Marxism and Literary Criticism by Terry Eagleton. Marxism is a highly complex subject, and that sector of it known as Marxist literary criticism is no less so. Marxist criticism analyzes literature in terms of the historical conditions which produce it, and it needs, similarly, to be aware of its own historical conditions. To give an account of a Marxist critic like, say, George Lucas, without examining the historical factors which shape his criticism is clearly inadequate. The most valuable way of discussing Marxist criticism, then, would be a historical survey of it from Marx and Engels to the present day, charting the ways in which that criticism changes as the history in which it is rooted changes. Marxism is a scientific theory of human societies and of the practice of transforming them. And what that means, rather more concretely, is that the narrative Marxism has to deliver is a story of the struggles of men and women to free themselves from certain forms of exploitation and oppression. Marxist criticism is part of a larger body of theoretical analysis which aims to understand ideologies, the ideas, values, and feelings by which men experience their societies at various times. And certain of those ideas, values, and feelings are available to us only in literature. To understand ideologies is to understand both the past and the present more deeply, and such understanding contributes to our liberation. Chapter 1: Literature and History. Marx, Engels, and Criticism. If Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are better known for their political and economic rather than literary writings, this is not in the least because they regarded literature as insignificant. It is true, as Leon Trotsky remarked in Literature and Revolution 1924, that there are many people in this world who think as revolutionists and feel as Philistines. But Marx and Engels were not of this number. The writings of Karl Marx, himself the youthful author of lyric poetry, a fragment of verse drama, and an unfinished comic novel much influenced by Laurence Sterne, are laced with literary concepts and allusions. He wrote a sizable unpublished manuscript on art and religion and planned a journal on dramatic criticism, a full length study of Balzac, and a treatise on aesthetics. Art and literature were part of the very air Marx breathed. As a formidably cultured German intellectual in the great classical tradition of his society. Even so, Marx and Engels had rather more important tasks on their hands than the formulation of a complete aesthetic theory. The comments on art and literature are scattered and fragmentary, glancing allusions rather than developed positions. This is one reason why Marxist criticism involves more than merely restating cases set out by the founders of Marxism. It also involves more than what has become known in the West as the sociology of literature. The sociology of literature concerns itself chiefly with what might be called the means of literary production, distribution, and exchange in a particular society. How books are published, the social composition of the authors and audiences, levels of literacy, the social determinants of taste. It also examines literary texts for the sociological relevance, reading literary works to abstract from them themes of interest to the social historian. Marxist criticism is not merely a sociology of literature, concerned with how novels get published and whether they mention the working class. Its aim is to explain the literary work more fully, and this means a sensitive attention to its forms, styles, and meanings. But it also means grasping those forms, styles, and meanings as the products of a particular history. The painter Henri Matisse once remarked that all art bears the imprint of its historical epoch, but that great art is that in which this imprint is most deeply marked. Marxist criticism has much to say on this issue, but the historical analysis of literature did not, of course, begin with Marxism. Many thinkers before Marx had tried to account for literary works in terms of the history which produced them. And one of these, the German idealist philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, had a profound influence on Marx on aesthetic thought. The originality of Marxist criticism, then, lies not in its historical approach to literature, but in its revolutionary understanding of history itself. Base and superstructure. The seeds of that revolutionary understanding are planted in a famous passage in Marx and Engels, The German Ideology, 1845 to 6. The production of ideas, concepts, and consciousness is first of all directly interwoven with the material intercourse of man, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the spiritual intercourse of men appear here as the direct effects of men's material behavior. We do not proceed from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as described, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at corporeal man. Rather, we proceed from the really active man. Consciousness does not determine life. Life determines consciousness. A fuller statement of what this means can be found in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of the will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of the material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The modes of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines the being, but on the contrary, social being that determines their consciousness. The social relations between men, in other words, are bound up with the way they produce the material life. Taken together, these forces and relations of production form what Marx calls the economic structure of society, or what is more commonly known by Marxism as the economic base or infrastructure. From this economic base, in every period emerges a superstructure, certain forms of law and politics, a certain kind of state whose essential function is to legitimate the power of the social class which owns the means of economic production. But the superstructure contains more than this. It also consists of certain definite forms of social consciousness, political, religious, ethical, aesthetic, and so on, which is what Marxism designates as ideology. The function of ideology also is to legitimate the power of the ruling class in society. In the last analysis, the dominant ideas of a society are the ideas of its ruling class. Art, then, is for Marxism part of the superstructure of society. To understand literature, then, means understanding the total social process of which it is part. As the Russian Marxist critic Georgy Plekhanov puts it, the social mentality of an age is conditioned by that age's social relations. This is no way quite as evident as in the history of art and literature. Literary works are not mysteriously inspired or explicable simply in terms of their author's psychology. They are forms of perception, particular ways of seeing the world, and as such they have a relation to that dominant way of seeing the world, which is the social mentality or ideology of an age. That ideology, in turn, is the product of the concrete social relations into which men enter at a particular time and place. It is the way those class relations are experienced, legitimized, and perpetuated. Moreover, men are not free to choose their social relations. They are constrained into them by material necessity, by the nature and stage of development of the mode of economic production. To understand King Lear, the Densiad or Ulysses is therefore to do more than interpret their symbolism, study their literary history, and add footnotes about sociological facts which enter into them. This is not an easy task, since an ideology is never a simple reflection of a ruling class ideas. On the contrary, it is always a complex phenomenon which may incorporate conflicting, even contradictory views of the world. To understand an ideology, we must analyze the precise relations between different classes in a society. And to do that means grasping where those classes stand in relation to the mode of production. The pessimism of Conrad's worldview is rather a unique transformation into art of an ideological pessimism in his period. A sense of history as futile and cyclical, of individuals as impenetrable and solitary, of human values as relativistic and irrational, which marks a drastic crisis in the ideology of the Western bourgeois class to which Conrad allied himself. Every writer is individually placed in society, responding to a general history from his own particular standpoint, making sense of it in his own concrete terms. Whether those insights are in political terms, progressive or reactionary, Conrad's are certainly the latter, is not the point, any more than it is to the point that most of the agreed major writers of the 20th century, Yeats, Eliot, Pound, Lawrence, are political conservatives who each had struck with fascism. Marxist criticism, rather than apologizing for that fact, explains it, sees that in the absence of genuinely revolutionary art, only a radical conservatism, hostile like Marxism to the withered values of liberal bourgeois society, could produce the most significant literature. Literature and superstructure. It would be a mistake to imply that Marxist criticism moves mechanically from text to ideology to social relations to productive forces. It is concerned rather with the unity of these levels of society. Literature may be part of the superstructure, but it is not merely the passive reflection of the economic base. Engels makes this clear in a letter to Joseph Bloch in 1890. According to the materialist conception of history, the determining element in history is ultimately the production and reproduction in real life. If therefore somebody twists this into the statement that the economic element is the only determining one, it transforms it into a meaningless abstract and Marxism and literary criticism absurd phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its consequences, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., forms of law, and then even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the combatants, political, legal, and philosophical theories, religious ideas, and their further development into systems of dogma also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles and, in many cases, preponderate in determining their form. Engels wants to deny that there is any mechanical one-to-one correspondence between base and superstructure. Elements of the superstructure constantly react back upon and influence the economic base. The materialist theory of history denies that art can in itself change the course of history, but it insists that art can be an active element in such change. Marx is considering here what he calls the unequal relationship of the development of material production to artistic production. It does not follow that the greatest artistic achievements depend upon the highest development of the productive forces. As the example of the Greeks who produced major art in an economically undeveloped society clearly evidences. Certain major artistic forms like the epic are only possible in an undeveloped society. The Greek arts and epic are bound up with certain forms of social development. The difficulty is that they still afford us artistic pleasure, and that in a certain respect they count as a norm and as an unattainable model. It is its result, rather, and is inextricably bound up, rather with the fact that the unripe social conditions under which it arose and could alone rise can never return. So our liking for Greek art is a nostalgic lapse back into childhood, a piece of unmaterialist sentimentalism, which hostile critics have gladly pounced on. The Greeks, Marx is arguing, were able to produce major art not in spite of but because of the undeveloped state of the society. In ancient societies, which have not yet undergone the fragmenting division of labor known to capitalism, the overwhelming of quality by quantity, which results from commodity production and the restless continual development of the productive forces, a certain measure of harmony can be achieved between man and nature. A harmony precisely dependent upon the limited nature of Greek society. Two questions then emerge from Marx's formulations in the Grendersee. The first concerns the relation between base and superstructure. The second concerns our own relation in the present with past art. We found in those ancient societies a primitive image of measure between man and nature, which capitalist society necessarily destroys, and which socialist society can reproduce at an incomparably higher level. We ought, in other words, to think of history in wider terms than our own contemporary history. It is a curiously narrowed view of history which defines it merely as the contemporary movement and relegates all else to the universal. One answer to the problem of past and present is suggested by Bertolt Brecht, who argues that we need to develop the historical sense into a real sensual delight. When our theatres perform plays of other periods, they like to annihilate distance, fill in the gap, close over the differences. But what comes then of our delight in comparisons, in distance, in dissimilarity, which is at the same time a delight in what is close and proper to ourselves? The other problem posed by the Grendersee is the relation between base and superstructure. Marx is clear that these two aspects of society do not form a symmetrical relationship, dancing a harmonious minute hand in hand throughout history. Each element of society's superstructure, art, law, politics, religion, has its own tempo of development, its own internal evolution. which is not reducible to a mere expression of the class struggle or the state of the economy. Art, as Trotsky comments, has a very high degree of autonomy. It is not tied in any simple one-to-one way to the mode of, and yet Marxism claims too that in the last analysis, art is determined by that mode of production. A vulgar Marxist case about T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land might be that the poem is directly determined by ideological and economic factors, by the spiritual emptiness and exhaustion of bourgeois ideology, which springs from that crisis of imperialist capitalism known as the First World. It says nothing, for instance, about the social situation of Eliot himself, a writer living in an ambiguous relationship with English society, as an aristocratic American expatriate who became a glorified city clerk and yet identified deeply with the conservative traditionalist rather than bourgeois commercialist elements of English ideology. It is silent about the form and language of the wasteland, about why Eliot, despite his extreme political conservatism, was an avant garde poet who selected certain progressive, experimental techniques from the history of literary forms available to him, and on what ideological basis he did this. We remain ignorant about the relation between the poem and the aesthetic theories associated with it, of what role that aesthetic plays in the ideology of the time, and how it shapes the construction of the poem itself. Any complete understanding of the wasteland would need to take these and other factors into account. It is not a matter of reducing the poem to the state of contemporary capitalism, but neither is it a matter of introducing so many judicious complications that anything as crude as capitalism may to all intents and purposes be forgotten. What Marxist criticism looks for is a unique conjuncture of these elements, which we know as the wasteland. No one of these elements can be conflated with another. Each has its own relative independence. The wasteland can indeed be explained as a poem which springs from a crisis of bourgeois ideology, but it has no simple correspondence with that crisis or with the political and economic conditions which produced it. As a poem, it does not, of course, know itself as a product of a particular ideological crisis, for if it did, it would cease to exist. It needs to translate that crisis into universal terms, to grasp it as part of an unchanging human condition, shared alike by ancient Egyptians and modern man. The wasteland's relation to the real history of its time, then, is highly mediated. And in this, it is like all works of art. Literature and ideology. Frederick Engels remarks in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, 1888, that art is far richer and more opaque than political and economic theory because it is less purely ideological. It is important here to grasp the precise meaning for Marxism of ideology. Ideology is not in the first place a set of doctrines. It signifies the way men live out their roles in class society, the values, ideas, and images which tie them to their social functions and so prevent them from a true knowledge of society as a whole. In this sense, the wasteland is ideological. It shows a man making sense of his experience in ways that prohibit a true understanding of his society ways that are consequently false. All art springs from an ideological conception of the world. There is no such thing, Plekhanov comments, as a work of art entirely devoid of ideological content. But Engels' remarks suggest that art has a more complex relationship to ideology than law and political theory, which rather more transparently embody the interest of a ruling class. The question then is what relationship art has to ideology? This is not an easy question to answer. Two extreme opposite positions are possible here. One is that literature is nothing but ideology in a certain artistic form, that works of literature are just expressions of the ideologies of their time. They are prisoners of false consciousness, unable to reach beyond it to arrive at the truth. It is a position characteristic of much vulgar Marxist criticism, which tends to see literary works merely as reflections of dominant ideology. The opposite case seizes on the fact that so much literature challenges the ideology it confronts and makes this part of the definition of literary art. Authentic art, as Ernst Fischer argues in his significantly entitled Art Against Ideology, 1969, always transcends the ideological limits of its time, yielding us insight into the realities which ideology hides from view. A most subtle, although still incomplete, account of the relationship between literature and ideology is provided by the French Marxist theorist Louis Althusser. Althusser argues that art cannot be reduced to ideology. It has rather a particular relationship to it. Ideology signifies the imaginary ways in which men experience the real world, which is, of course, the kind of experience literature gives us too. What it feels like to live in particular conditions, rather than a conceptual analysis of those conditions. However, art does more than just passively reflect that experience. In doing this, art does not enable us to know the truth which ideology conceals. Since for Althusser, knowledge in the strict sense means scientific knowledge, the kind of knowledge of, say, capitalism, which Marx Capital rather than Dickens' Hard Times allows us. The difference between science and art is not that they deal with different objects, but that they deal with the same objects in different ways. Science gives us conceptual knowledge of a situation. Art gives us the experience of that situation, which is equivalent to ideology. How literature can do this is more fully developed by one of Althusser's colleagues, Pierre Macquarie. In his work, which is written in 1966, Macquarie distinguishes between what he terms illusion, meaning essentially ideology, and fiction, illusion, the ordinary ideological experience of man, is the material on which the writer goes to work. But in working on it, he transforms it into something different, lends it a shape and structure. It is by giving ideology a determinate form, fixing it within certain fictional limits, that art is able to distance itself from it, thus revealing to us the limits of that ideology. In doing this, Macquarie claims, art contributes to our deliverance from the ideological illusion. Ideology, for both critics, is more than an amorphous body of free-floating images and ideas. In any society, it has a certain structural coherence. A scientific criticism would seek to explain the literary work in terms of the ideological structure of which it is part, yet which it transforms in its art. It would search out the principle which both ties the work to ideology and distances it from. The finest Marxist criticism has indeed done precisely that. Macquarie's standing point is Lenin's brilliant analysis of Tolstoy. To do this, however, means grasping the literary work as a formal structure, and it is to this question that we can now turn. Thank you. Have a nice day.